Hello students, so in today's video we would like to take a closer look at geometry, right? So you have actually hopefully look at the SLS lessons on the nature of geometry. So once you have done that, you should be able to actually fill in the necessary blanks here, right? So let's understand what geometry means. So first of all, what exactly is geometry? As you can see, geometry, the word itself came from the word geo, which means earth, and metron, which means to measure. So we like to measure stuffs. And what are we measuring? So in order to measure, we need a couple of things. So let's look at this portion here on measure, the big ideas, right? Let's turn to my pen. So measurements, we want to be able to have some kind of precision, right? How do I spell that? I spelled that wrongly, didn't I? Yes, I did. Let's go back, change it. Right, precision, right? So when we measure things, we want to be accurate. And the thing is, there are many cultures evolving their own style of measurements since time immemorable, right? So over the years, as we consolidate information and time, there's some form of standardization that needs to take place, okay? Because without standardization, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to trying to communicate between cultures as well as trade. So some of the common things that we standardize in terms of measure is the measurement of time, right? Initially, every culture has their own way of measuring time, then it's standardized. We also want to standardize the measurement of mass as well as length, right? So these are things that we measure. Now, in geometry, we actually also measure these things, right? In particularly, we are also very concerned about length. But other than that, another thing that we like to measure when it relates to shapes is actually angles, because we know shapes have angles, right? So of course we want to measure angles. And in terms of measuring angles, there are two units that we do use. We started out using the units of degree. It comes from the 360 degrees is approximately a year, and that's how our mathematicians of the past actually figure out a good unit of measurements for angles. However, in today's context, with all the engineering and all the modern technology, the unit known as the radian is a lot more convenient, and we will look at radian in a later chapter, probably in next year of your study or the year after, right? So that's about angles. Coming on to the other side, we also want to understand some of the mathematical object when we talk about geometry, right? And the most basic object we want to look at, of course, is the point, right? A point tells us the location of certain point, right? I mean, every object actually lies in a position, and the point gives us that position. And it is zero dimension because a point is actually invisible to the eye, right? We can't see it. It doesn't really have a concrete entity, but it tells us a position. Then, of course, when we have the concept of points, however, and we try to visualize that they actually line up together, we create something called a line. And a line is what we call a one-dimensional mathematical object. And when it comes to lines, there are a couple of different types of lines, right? We talk about the line. It has no beginning and end. It goes on forever. Then when we want to denote line with a starting point and ending point, we have the line segment. And finally, there are many lines in our natural occurring world where it has a starting point but no ending point. This we call the rays. Okay? So how do lines behave, right? When we talk about how lines interact, when two lines actually interact with each other, we say that they intersect, right? So that's where a intersection point is actually formed, right? There are also some other properties of lines. There are lines that are parallel, okay, which means they run side by side with each other and they don't really meet, they don't intersect. And then there is the perpendicular. Perpendicular lines are lines that cross each other at right angles or 90 degrees as we understand it. Okay, and they are very useful concepts when it comes to the study of lines, right? So that's for the lines. Now let's coming up to actually shapes, right? Because when we have lines and they join together to form a shape. So we talk about figures. Now when we talk about figures, there are actually two main categories. There are the two-dimensional ones and there are the three-dimensional ones. So two-dimensional, we usually says that this figure lies on a two-dimensional plane. And some of the shapes that we study them includes the regular ones that we know, your circle, your squares, your rectangles, and so on and so forth, right? And all your polygons, right? And then when it comes to three dimension, we usually call them three-dimension solids, right? So they will include things like your cylinder, your sphere, right? Your cuboid, etc., etc. I'm sure, and cone and so on. I'm sure there are lots of examples and pyramids and so on. So that is two-dimensional planes, shapes on it, figures on it, and three-dimensional figure on their called solids. Now, of course, we also look at some of the relationship between all these objects, right? So first of all, there's various distance between them, right? So the distance within the shapes and the figure, the solids, we actually talk about the length in them. So things like the circumference, right? The big word to spell, and the perimeter, and so on and so forth, right? So we talk about measuring the circumference, measuring the perimeter, and then there is the surface where we talk about the area of the circle, right? Areas of all your various shapes, right? Area of circle, area of trapezium, area of parallelograms, and that is just two-dimensional area. There's also three-dimensional, right? Three-dimensional, you got your surface area, and the surface area of various shapes as well, your cone, your pyramid, and so on. Then of course there's the surface area, and then of course three-dimensional, we talk about space. So when we talk about space, we talk mostly about volume, right? So you have your volumes of the various shapes. So this is actually the what we are actually investigating when we talk about geometry. So moving on, so let's focus back on our idea of angles. Now angles, the most basic type of angles of course is your right angle, right? They are perpendicular and they are 90 degrees. However, depending on how the angle changes, they have specific names just to help us to navigate. So if I have an angle between 0 degree, 0 degrees to 90 degrees, we call it the acute angles. Of course, the right angle is exactly 90 degrees, right? Between 90 degrees to 180 degrees, we call these type angles obtuse. And when it's 180 degrees, well, it's a straight line. And of course, beyond that, up to 360 degrees, we call this the reflex angles. What happens after 360 degrees? Well, it goes back to being an acute angle, right? So it's a cycle, it goes on. So when two or more angles are placed adjacent to each other, that means they're placed side by side, sometimes they have special properties, right? So if the angles add up to 90 degrees, we call these complementary angles. And where it adds up to 180 degrees, we call it supplementary angles. And there are many situations where an angle is either complementary or supplementary. So that's a big idea, right? So let's move on to lesson 2. I will actually pause here and continue this lesson 2.